Childhood is often seen as a fortress of innocence, a place where children should only know laughter, school, and family. But sometimes that wall cracks, revealing a chilling truth. Not every young gaze is harmless. Imagine a 14-year-old leaving behind an unfinished notebook on his desk, never to return. Or a 15-year-old walking into the night not to play with friends, but to kill. These images send shivers down our spine, reminding us that crime is not confined to adults. In this series, we uncover 5 of America's youngest serial killers, captured before they even reached adulthood. These are not just shocking crimes, they expose broken families, ignored warning signs, and a justice system forced to ask, should society treat a child who kills as an adult? This is the story of innocence stolen, and of young souls who chose a path drenched in blood. He was a pale boy from South Boston with a stare. Adults remembered for years a stare that seemed older than his age. Jesse Pomeroy was not yet 15 when Boston learned his name the hard way. Before the murders, there had been warnings. Younger boys lured to empty lots and sheds. Stripped, whipped, cut. The city called them assaults. Investigators later called them rehearsals. Jesse's home life was a knot of instability. A strict mother, a father whose temper flared, and a child who kept folding inward. Neighbors noticed the solitude, the way he watched other children, the quick flash of cruelty toward animals. Teachers saw little and said less. In those days, a troubled boy could disappear in plain sight. The first murder shattered that illusion. In late winter, a small boy named Horace Millen vanished near the waterfront. He was found soon after, his body marked by a brutality that startled even hardened officers. The scene suggested control and escalation, not an accident, not a sudden rage, but a pattern. Weeks earlier, a girl named Katie Curran, not yet a teenager, had gone missing after being seen near a neighborhood shop. Rumors grew until searchers found what they feared most: remains hidden where no child should have to be remembered. 2 victims, 2 separate episodes, a signature beginning to form. Jesse was questioned. The investigators noted his scars, especially the white line at his lip, and the way he recounted details he was not supposed to know. He shifted explanations. He tried to borrow adult language from motives he did not understand. But evidence kept circling back the timeline, the geography, the prior assaults that matched the methods. When officers finally moved, they found a boy who seemed both frightened and strangely composed, as if calculation and panic lived in the same small frame. Courtrooms strain when a child is accused of adult crimes. The law had to ask impossible questions. How do you weigh intent when the face is still that of a schoolboy? How do you measure danger when the pattern already shows repetition? Boston's answer was severe. A jury said first-degree murder. A judge pronounced death. Then the sentence shifted, commuted to life, and the years that followed turned into a long confinement that would outlast his youth by decades. He grew older in cells while the city tried to forget how young he had been when terror wore his features. Jesse's case forced a reckoning that echoes even now. It exposed how communities miss early alarms, how cruelty can metastasize when no one intervenes, how a child can memorize pain and then pass it on. It also left lingering doubt about what punishment means when the perpetrator is barely past childhood. Rehabilitation felt remote. Risk felt immediate. The outcome, a lifetime behind walls, was less an answer than a containment. And yet, one question kept stalking every Boston street the searchers had walked. What turns a lonely boy into a repeat killer before he can even vote or shave? Hold that thought, because the next case will show how quickly a teenager's violence can multiply, and how a single night can end 4 lives before the sun comes up. He was the kind of neighbor a quiet cul-de-sac learns to overlook a lanky kid on a bike, a laugh that came easily, a home just a few doors down from the victims. Craig Price was 15 years old when the mask dropped in Warwick, Rhode Island. Long before police said the word serial, the neighborhood had already been keeping a different tally. Dogs that barked at nothing, porch lights that stayed on past midnight, and whispers about a teenager who seemed to prowl when others slept. The timeline split the story in 2. In late summer of 1987, a woman named Rebecca Spencer was found stabbed dozens of times in her modest home. There were no defensive wounds that made sense, no forced entry that held, and no suspect who fit an adult profile. The case cooled. Then, 2 years later, in early autumn of 1989, the pattern erupted. Joan Heaton and her daughters Jennifer and little Melissa were discovered in their house, slain with a ferocity that stunned even veteran detectives. The scenes were separate in time, but twins in method, a ruthless onslaught with a knife, wounds concentrated and frenzied, traces suggesting the killer felt at home inside other people's rooms. Police followed the seam's shoe prints, fibers, a broken screen logic of entry and exit, and the seams led next door. Price's proximity was not just geographic. He was a teenager in motion, out late, blending in by virtue of his age. When detectives finally brought him in, the confession came like a dam breaking, matter-of-fact, detail-rich, delivered by a boy who spoke about life and death as if they were items on a list. He admitted both episodes, Rebecca in 1987, the Heatons in 1989, 2 separate events, one growing appetite. Then came the collision between monstrous facts and juvenile law. Because Price was under 18, the system could not try him as an adult for those crimes. No life sentence, no decades stacked end to end. The most Rhode Island could do, under the statutes of that moment, was hold him in a youth facility until his 21st birthday. The result felt impossible to the families. 4 lives gone. And the perpetrator, by law, could be free while still young. Outrage built, editorials thundered. State legislators rewrote statutes in his shadow. And Craig Price did not grow smaller with the years. Behind bars, he racked up infractions, fights, threats. A new violent conviction that kept pushing freedom away. The boy who, by law, was once destined to walk out a legal adult, instead became a man shackled to his own record. Decades later, he remained the cautionary tale that changed a state's thinking about what a juvenile can be capable of, and how a justice system must answer when youth and brutality collide. What lingers is not only the savagery of the acts, but the revelation they forced. A teenager can hide in plain sight, slip through legal gaps, and still leave a permanent mark on the law. The lesson traveled beyond one cul-de-sac, beyond one town, and the next case would make that lesson national. A teenager with a rifle, a map of the Beltway, and a trail of fear that moved with every mile. He was a teenager with a shy smile and a restless gaze, a face that could vanish in a crowd at a gas station. Boyd Malvo was still 17 when the Beltway began to feel like a chessboard, and every parked car might be a rook aiming from a distance. Before police linked the pattern, the fear arrived first. Commuters ducking at fuel pumps, parents rushing children from minivans to front doors, a region learning to move with its shoulders hunched. Malvo did not act alone. The older man beside him, a mentor and a captor in the same skin, had a plan that turned mobility into camouflage. They used ordinary spaces, mall lots, school fields, commuter corridors, and stitched them together with interstate asphalt. Attacks unfolded with a chilling rhythm. One moment quiet, the next a single crack of a rifle, then silence. No chase, no shouted threat, just distance, precision, and a predator's patience. What made it feel endless was the simplicity. A blue sedan could be any blue sedan. A trunk became a hide. A hole cut near the license plate turned into a narrow eye on the world. Witnesses saw nothing but everyday life. Investigators faced a moving ghost. Different counties, different jurisdictions. Clues left as if by wind. Yet as the map filled with pins, a shape emerged. Gas stations, park and ride lots, places where people stood still for a heartbeat too long. Malvo's youth did not soften the scenes. Victims were chosen for routine, not for feud or grudge. Morning, evening, late night, a single shot collapsed a life and scattered a neighborhood into whispers. The calls to 911 carried the same tremor. No argument, no warning, just a person falling. It was the kind of serial violence that taught millions a new, smaller way to stand in public. One shoulder turned, one eye measuring distance from the curb. When the pair was finally cornered, it was not by a dramatic chase, but by fatigue, tips, and methodical work that tightened a circle across state lines. In the end, officers opened a trunk and found the rifle. The cutout, the proof that terror can be built with tools bought at any hardware aisle. Malvo, still a teenager, confronted a courtroom stare and a nation's outrage. The law had to divide age from culpability, mentorship from manipulation, and still honor a map of the dead. Judges and juries answered with life stacked upon life, acknowledgments that youth cannot erase intent when intent is repeated, planned, and cold. Later years would bring legal debates about juvenile sentencing, about brains still wiring themselves, about capacity to change. But those debates did not redraw the map. The pins remained, the names remained, the shock remained that such calculated detachment could live inside a boy's frame. Malvo's case is not only a record of deaths, it is a study in how fear travels, how a rifle in one trunk can shrink an entire Capitol corridor, how mentorship can deform into machinery, how a teenager can be taught to watch through a keyhole and see targets instead of people. Remember that keyhole, because the next case pulls us indoors, into city apartments and alleys, where a young killer carried a knife instead of a rifle, and left a city writing messages on mirrors made of dread. He was 16 years old when Oklahoma learned his name and never forgot it. Sean Sellers did not begin with a massacre. He began with a single shot across a convenience store counter in the late hours of 1985. A clerk slumped to the floor. A cash drawer rattled. A camera blinked, and somewhere, a teenager told himself that what he had just done could be folded into the night. It could not. At home, the world was a low-grade thunder. A mother trying to hold a household together. A stepfather whose authority felt like a closed door. Sean drifted toward late-night rituals of power and control, candles, symbols, the lure of rule-breaking that felt like armor against loneliness. In notebooks and private corners, he rehearsed the idea that intention might be stronger than consequence. Like many teenagers, he was searching for a self. Unlike most, he learned to search with a weapon within reach. The line he crossed the first time did not hold. Months later, in the small hours of 1986, he stood in a hallway, lit by the thinnest thread of house light, and aimed at the two people who knew him best. The shots were quick, intimate, final. A son turning a family bedroom into an ending. Two separate incidents, split by seasons, tied by escalation. The pattern was unmistakable. Repetition, planning, and a chilling willingness to convert private grievance into irreversible act. When police closed in, they met not a veteran criminal, but a boy who moved between boast and bewilderment, one moment claiming dark forces had guided him, another offering a rationale as ordinary as anger. Defense attorneys would later press the story of demonic obsession, a portrait of a 16-year-old, lost in fantasies that wrapped violence in myth. Prosecutors answered with the facts that could not be explained away. The clerk, the mother, the stepfather. Shootings separated by time. A teenager who had already learned to narrate his own intent. Courtrooms are not laboratories, and justice does not test hypotheses. It weighs actions. Juries listen to competing scripts, possession and repentance on one side, choice and consequence on the other, and delivered their own clear sentence. Oklahoma's law did what it had rarely done. It imposed the ultimate penalty on someone who had been 16 when he pulled the trigger at home. Years passed. In prison, Sean found religion, wrote letters, spoke about a changed heart. Outside, families lived with the arithmetic of loss that sermons could not balance. The debate that trailed his case expanded beyond one state. What should a system do with a teenager whose violence is repeated and planned? Where is the boundary between adolescent malleability and adult accountability? In later years, national rulings would reshape the map for juvenile punishment, but they would not reach back to erase what Oklahoma had already done. The execution took place in the final spring of the 1990s, a stark period, at the end of a stark sentence. Sean Sellers remains a difficult mirror, a boy who crossed the line twice, at two different moments, against strangers and blood. His path forces us to look at the stories teenagers tell themselves in the dark, and at the moments when an adult world fails to interrupt those stories before they harden into action. Hold that thought, because the next case brings us north to a city gripped by terror and a teenager whose alleged confession turned into a lifetime behind bars, while a single word scrawled in lipstick taught a metropolis to fear its own mirrors. He was 17 when Chicago learned to fear mirrors. William Hirons did not look like a monster in a hallway. He looked like a bright student with a neat haircut and a habit of breaking into apartments to steal. But in the winter and summer of 1945, and again in the first days of 1946, three separate scenes told a darker story. A woman named Josephine Ross, found in her home with wounds that spoke of control more than chaos. Weeks later, Frances Brown, in a bathroom made infamous by a message smeared in lipstick across a wall, and then a child, Suzanne Denyon, taken from her bedroom in the night and found in pieces that would haunt the city's conscience for decades. The message was a plea and a dare at once. A sentence scrawled by a hand that wanted to be read. Police chased leads through boarding houses and alleys, through pawn slips and burglary reports. Through the city's constant motion, Hirons kept moving too, a teenager who knew how to climb a drain pipe and slip a latch, who seemed to treat locked windows like puzzles. When officers finally caught him, it was not at a crime scene, but during a routine burglary stakeout where a gun went off and everything changed. He was wrestled down, searched, questioned, and folded into an investigation that had already terrified a metropolis. Interrogations in those days were long, and lines between pressure and coercion were thin. Defense lawyers would later say that Hirons was pushed to the edge, that hypnosis and sodium pentothal stained the record. Prosecutors answered with exhibits that ordinary citizens could understand: the tools of entry, the matching threads of method, the geography that tied one quiet block to another. In the end, the legal machinery did not want a mystery. It wanted a conclusion the public could hold. Hirons signed confessions. He stood in court and entered guilty pleas. The judge accepted. The sentences stacked across a lifetime. For many, the case seemed settled. 3 victims, 3 separate episodes, a signature left in lipstick, and a teenager whose burglar's agility had crossed into murder. For others, doubts lingered about process, about pressure, about the reliability of words spoken under the weight of a city's panic. Yet the names of the dead did not change, and the families' calendars did not flip backward. Chicago adapted the way cities do after trauma, by putting new locks on old doors and teaching children the language of caution. Hirons grew old behind walls. He studied. He repaired televisions. He became a man who had once been a boy everyone feared. Appeals rose and fell. Journalists revisited the story, some with skepticism, some with certainty. The photographs remained the same: the bathroom message in lipstick, the black and white portrait of a child whose window had been a mouth into the night, the tight knot of officers outside a brownstone. The lesson that survives is double-edged. A teenager can be both an accomplished burglar and an accused killer, both a student and a symbol. And a city can teach itself to fear surfaces, mirrors, tiles, even handwriting, because of what once appeared there. Whether you see justice completed or justice complicated often depends on which piece of the record you hold up to the light. Hold that image of a city speaking through a bathroom wall, because next we travel to Pennsylvania, where a different kind of message appeared in alleyways and bedrooms, not in words, but in repeated brutality. And a 17-year-old's escalation would push investigators toward the hardest penalty the law allows. Our ranking follows a clear, narrow frame. First, definition. We use the investigative standard for serial, at least 2 victims in separate incidents. Spree killings contained within one continuous event do not qualify. Co-offenders are included only when the youth's individual conduct meets the serial threshold. Second, scope. Cases are United States only, and each offender was captured before turning 21. When crimes straddled juvenile and adult years, we weighed the full pattern but preserved the age at capture rule. Third, evidence quality. We prioritize convictions and corroborated facts from court records and major outlets. Where controversy exists, coerced confessions, disputed forensics, shifting statements, we flag it inside the script and avoid speculation. Fourth, severity and scale. Victim count matters, but it is not the sole driver. We consider escalation, planning, and the temporal spread of attacks. A shorter series showing clear rehearsal and control may outrank a longer pattern driven by opportunity. Fifth, social impact. We account for measurable effects, legislative change, policy reforms, large-scale fear, or altered public behavior. When a single case reshaped juvenile sentencing or daily routines, that weight appears in placement. Sixth, legal outcome and risk. Lifelong incapacitation, death sentences, or prolonged custody indicate judicial assessment of danger. Failed rehabilitation after early capture also adds weight. Finally, youth as context. not excuse. Age informs interpretation, never mitigation. The list is an examination, not exaltation. Hold these rules as you revisit the 10 names, because in the closing segment, we will turn those criteria back on us and ask what they reveal about the thin line between prevention and hindsight. The 10 cases we have examined stretch across more than a century of American history, from Jesse Pomeroy in 19th century Boston to Edmund Kemper in the restless California of the 1970 seconds, and beyond, to names that changed laws in the late 20th century. Each profile stands on its own, but together they sketch a disturbing portrait. Age is not always a shield, and violence does not always wait for adulthood. What joins these stories is not a single motive or upbringing, but a common factor. A boy overlooked, a teenager dismissed, an environment that magnified rather than eased anger. In every case, warnings existed: cruelty to animals, truancy, bursts of aggression, broken homes, untreated illness. Yet those signals often slid past the adults nearby until the violence had already spoken louder than any warning could. The legal system staggered to keep pace. Some states discovered their statutes could not hold a 15-year-old who had killed more than once. Others faced the moral paradox of treating a teenager as both a child to be reformed and an adult to be punished. Out of that struggle came new laws, sharper sentencing, and in some places, permanent changes in how juveniles are handled. But behind statutes and precedents remain the human echoes: families who lost, communities that adapted habits of fear, survivors who ran and lived to testify. They remind us that prevention is not an abstract term. It means teachers who notice, parents who act, neighbors who speak, clinicians who intervene. Every missed opportunity becomes a story retold in darker ink. As we close, remember that none of these names were destined. They were shaped by choices, by neglect, by chance, and by flaws in the systems meant to protect. Their legacy should not be fascination with their methods, but vigilance about the signs we might still recognize in the young people around us. The line between childhood and monstrosity is thinner than we like to admit. What we do with that knowledge, whether we act early or only after we look back, is the test every society continues to face.